Welcome to GRE Snacks, snackable episodes about the GRE exam and graduate school admissions. I'm Tyler, the founder of Achievable, and we have an affordable GRE course that includes everything you need to ace your GRE exam. A full textbook, videos on key topics, tons of GRE questions that are backed by our memory-enhancing algorithm, a built-in study planner and machine learning essay grader, and full-length practice exams. You can try it out for free by visiting achievable.me, and if you like it, the code podcast will get you 10% off at checkout. Now, let's get started. Today we've got Brian Prestia from Reason Test Prep back with us, and Brian, I'd love if you could introduce yourself to the people who haven't heard you before. Welcome back.
Yeah, sure. Thanks for having me back, Tyler. So yeah, I am the owner of Reason Test Prep. We do online tutoring for the SAT, ACT, GMAT, and GRE. And our main focus is really the graduate tests, the GMAT and the GRE. And I've personally been doing those tests for about 20 years. And yep, GRE was the one that I started with. So that's the test that I have the longest experience with.
Yeah, no, thanks for sharing. And I am excited to dig in today on, a kind of a tricky question type that maybe doesn't get a ton of coverage, but argument questions. So, are argument questions a subset of reading comprehension questions, or are they like a whole question type like reading comprehension is?
Yeah, it's a great question. I guess you could say they're kind of both. So according to ETS, it's they're a subset of reading comprehension questions. So ETS just calls it all reading comp. If it's like passage based,
Hmm.
but I think that's really like misleading and unfortunate because on the GMAT and on the LSAT, argument questions are a totally separate question type. I mean, on the LSAT, it's a separate section of the test.
Hmm.
Actually, it's got its own section. So yeah, it's confusing to actually call them reading comp in the first place, but that's what ETS does. So yeah, I would think of these really as distinct question types. And I think, like you said, they're not a huge part of the test really. So it's a tricky thing because there's definitely a lot of skill and a lot of practice that could go into being good at these questions, and yet they're roughly, let's say, 10% of the verbal section, so
Hmm.
it's not the most important in terms of volume.
Yeah, but if you're aiming for a top score, it's good to get mastery of all the question types, right? So, how would you define, like, for somebody who's listening, how would you help them identify what an argument question is, first and foremost?
Yeah, yeah, that's a great question. I actually was gonna kind of dive into that. I'm glad you asked. So, yeah, I mean that is the first thing is like, how do you even know that you're dealing with an argument question? So, on the GRE, right? Like traditional, what's called traditional reading comp versus argument.
Hmm.
So, traditional reading comp will pretty much always have more than one question with it. It could be a short like passage, so it could look like lengthwise. It could look like an argument question because it could be just like a single paragraph. Traditional reading comp can, but it will almost always have multiple. Everything I've ever seen has multiple questions with it, whereas an argument question will almost always have one question. So the first thing is when you're taking the test or you're doing a practice test, you can just quickly skip to the next question and be like, wait, is there another question on this passage? If so, it's almost certainly reading comp. If there isn't, if it switches to something else, then it was almost certainly an argument question. So that's like the easy, you can almost do that without even like reading the prompt, basically.
Mm.
And then, yeah, I guess if it's short, if it's a long passage, it's reading comp if it's got more than one paragraph. If it's really short, then the other thing that you could do besides just like jumping to the next question and seeing if the passage changes is then just look at the question. And if the question says something like, what would strengthen this argument? What would weaken the argument? What's an assumption the argument makes? Something along those lines, well, then it's an argument question. And if it's something more kind of reading comp-ish, like what's the author's purpose? Or, what does the author say about this? Or something like that, then it's reading comp.
Got it. Okay, that makes sense. So then, yeah,
Yeah.
what are your tips for kind of solving argument questions, right? I don't know if you have a specific one that you want to like read off, or if you just want to kind of talk generally about them.
Yeah, maybe start general and then I guess we could get more specific. But so I guess the first thing is there. I feel like I've said this on the other episodes that I've done, but there's a lot. There's a lot that I could say. I mean, this is again a question type that appears on the GMAT, And, we'll spend, hours and hours and hours helping people with these questions, much more really than you spend on reading comp, actually, because it's a much more tricky, complicated question type. So there's quite a lot that you could do here. But I guess the first thing is I would identify what type of argument question it is. So there are different types of argument questions. There are strengthen, weaken, assumption questions. Those are the first three I kind of rattled off before. And I would add one more to the grouping there and call it the big four. So that's kind of a terminology we use, but the big four are strengthen, weaken, assumption, and then finally useful to evaluate questions. So they ask you like what additional information would be useful to better evaluate the argument or the conclusion. That's the bulk of it. Like I think if you're going to spend time studying and practicing on these questions, the argument questions, those four are the ones to really focus on. They appear the most frequently. They're also the ones that people tend to have the most trouble with. So I'd say there's a specific strategy for those questions that we could talk about. And then separately, you also have, inference questions and explain questions and occasionally like boldface questions. So there are a few other question types that appear, but yeah, I think if you're going to, aiming for a top score and you're going to spend time on this, really the place to start and to spend most of your time would be on these big four questions. So if you want, I can kind of elaborate on sort of what the strategy would be there.
Yeah, I think that's a good place to start.
Okay. So yeah, again, very high level. The big four questions all have the same structure. Okay. They're going to have a conclusion, they're going to have evidence, and there's going to be some gap in the argument. So, some leap that the argument makes from the evidence to the conclusion. And really the key to these questions is to be very, very precise in your understanding of, what the conclusion is, what the evidence is, and then start to think about what are some gaps in the argument. So what are some things that the conclusion, is saying that the evidence isn't saying? Or, why would the conclusion not necessarily follow from the evidence? And yeah, I think that's really the key. I mean, there's some, bunch of other steps we could throw in, but the key is to really break down the argument and understand what the gaps are between the evidence and the conclusion. And then all of those questions of those big four ones, they all pivot off of that understanding of that gap. So, if if it's a strengthen question, you're trying to take that gap and think about how you would pivot it in the direction of strengthening the argument. If it's a weaken question, you would take that gap and think about how you'd pivot that in the direction of weakening. So I could give you more specific examples, but that's basically it, is identify the gap and then go to the answer choices and find an answer that is going to be, sort of in that space, in that gap between the evidence and the conclusion.
Yeah. Do you ever feel like do you feel like it's just deliberating, what the gap is? Or do you feel like there's also sort of shades of gray in some of these questions where it's like there's strengthened and then there's strengthened even more, right?
Do you mean when it comes to the answer choices, and that like if it's a strengthened question that you feel like one answer kind of strengthens the argument and then another answer sort of strengthens it more than the previous answer?
Yeah, that's what I'm asking. Does that come up at all, basically? And then if so, what do you do?
Yeah, so this harkens back to one of our earlier episodes, which I fortunately went back and listened to refresh my memory to make sure I wasn't totally repeating myself. But in that episode about ambiguity on verbal questions, this is a big point for us at Reason Test Prep, and honestly for me personally, because it describes like why I think I've had success on the verbal section of the GRE and GMAT too. It's that it shouldn't be ambiguous, right? So it might seem like one answer is strengthening the argument and then another answer is strengthening it even more, but I would say in most cases, close to all cases, that's going to be an illusion. And they're not really both strengthening the argument. One of them is strengthening it, and maybe not even much. It might strengthen it a little bit, but it is in fact strengthening it. And the other one is just not strengthening it, or not necessarily strengthening it. So like you could have an answer, this could, we're going to go on a little tangent here if you want here, but getting at wrong answers, right? So when you have a word like some on a strengthen in the answer choice of a strengthen or weaken question, okay, that's usually part of a wrong answer. Because if I say something like, maybe we have to give a like fictitious argument here, but if the answer says something like, some people might choose not to do this, right?
Hmm.
That doesn't necessarily mean anything, right? The fact that some people might not do it doesn't mean that, most people, wouldn't do it, or, something like that. So you might be like, well, like, if that some people meant that, the majority, that would strengthen the argument. Okay. But if that some people meant only 4 people out of a million, then it wouldn't strengthen the argument. So, you sometimes have wrong answers that like could potentially strengthen or weaken an argument if you interpret it in a particular way, but they don't necessarily strengthen or weaken the argument. And that's why they're not the right answer. So,
Right. Okay. So it's
yeah.
like basically, and this is almost like a general tip for answer choices, right? But it's just like removing ambiguity is generally a good thing, right? Or potentially ambiguous answers are usually wrong.
Yeah, I mean it's more than I think I'm using ambiguity in two ways here that are maybe confusing. So generally you don't want an answer that's ambiguous. If it could be interpreted in multiple ways, that's probably not the right answer. So again, the word some is problematic because that leaves open a lot of room for interpretation, and that's usually why it's the wrong answer in like a strengthened or weakened question. But then there's like another level of ambiguity, which is that people perceive that the verbal section is the questions on the verbal section are by nature ambiguous, that like there's a gradation of answers, and you have an answer that really strengthens an argument, then one that like strengthens it a little less, then one that strengthens it a little less than that. So you could have like 5 answers that all strengthen the argument, but you're trying to pick the one that like most strengthens the argument. And I would say that's just a misunderstanding of the test. I mean, I could probably find some questions that are, not great questions or feel a little bit flawed, or, don't maybe perfectly match that. But I'd say, 98% of questions are unambiguous in the sense that there's a definitive right answer and definitive wrong answers. So yeah, like on a strengthen or weaken question, I would say in almost every case, I could tell you, I'm not saying I could do this on every question ever, but certainly the ones that I've like looked at and thought about and, directly know the answer to, why the right answer is definitely strengthening the argument, and why the other answers just don't strengthen it, right? It's not that they strengthen it less, it's that they just don't actually strengthen it.
Hmm. Right. And so
So,
is
yeah.
vocab, is this where the vocab becomes important? Do you feel like?
Sometimes I think maybe a better way to frame that would be around precision.
Mm.
So I don't know if it's like lack of understanding of words that really trips people up as much as it is lack of precision in how you are digesting and understanding certain words, So, like obviously everyone knows the definition of the word some, and everyone knows the definition of the word most. But if you put those words in the answer choices of a question, people who are not great at these argument questions, and who are not great maybe in general at reading comp, um, and who are not being precise enough, like they won't even notice. You know what I mean? Like they'll notice it when you point it out, and it'll be obvious to them after the fact why one of those is definitely wrong. But yeah, and this gets back to the point I kind of just threw in a little bit randomly earlier, which is that precision, right? Like when you read the argument, and really the answers too, you have to read it with a level of precision
Hmm.
that goes beyond the level of precision that you're usually bringing to bear on like the things that you read. So yeah, I don't know if I think on the argument questions, maybe less vocab and more like lack of precision that people like suffer from.
Right. Yeah, that makes a ton of sense. Um,
Yeah.
I also, yeah, it's like knowing what they're going for with when they're asking you the question, right? Like trying to decipher kind of the nuance of what they're asking for, right? I think is really important.
Yeah. Yeah, I think again, this is why I mean so many people we see who are studying for the GRE, they honestly don't even recognize that these argument questions are separate, really separate question types, or should be thought of as separate from reading comp. So they'll just read it like they're reading like a reading comp passage. And And, if you're talking about like making sure you understand like what the test is looking for, well, you're definitely not understanding what the test is looking for if you're reading an argument passage as though it's just a traditional reading comp passage. Like, you really have to actually have a totally different style of reading where you're not just reading it and trying to think about like the author's intention. You're much more reading for like, again, what is the conclusion of the argument? What is the evidence of the argument? What are some gaps in the argument? So it's actually a totally different style of reading and kind of breaking down the passage. And that's what they're looking for. Like, people who are good at these questions are doing that, whether they even know they're doing it or not. That's what they're doing. And people who are, not great at these like strength and weaken assumption type questions, they're usually just reading it very flatly and, just kind of for general comprehension, but they're not reading it critically and thinking about how to sort of attack the argument.
Right. Got it. That makes a lot of sense. Was that just the first of 4 tips, or like, yeah? What else were we trying to cover today?
Yeah. So I mean, I think there's a lot more. I mean,
Yeah.
even to talk about with these argument questions. I mean, I don't know if we want to get into the weeds on this completely, but first of all, I think there are
we
patterns.
do. Let's go fully into the weeds, right? Because this is, I think, something that doesn't get covered very often.
Okay. Well, so I guess 2 directions to go from here, and you tell me what you think would be, most helpful. One is, that was really just like the big 4. There are other question types that we could talk about, like inference questions and explain questions, and that's one thing. Another thing is wrong answer patterns on these argument questions. That's another, important thing. So again, when you were saying like knowing what the test writers are looking for, I don't know if they're looking for people to memorize wrong answer patterns, but they're certainly rewarding people who can pick up on the typical wrong answers.
Right. Yeah, and I think that's, I mean, do you have any advice for like what typical wrong answers are, or kind of what they look like?
Yeah. Do we want to stay narrowly within the argument questions right now? Because I have a whole nother batch for traditional reading comp.
Just
We
for
can get to that
argument. Yeah, just for argument.
Yeah. Okay. So yes. So let me give you this is the way we teach it. This is honestly the way I think of it as well. So you could think of 2 categories of wrong answer types on these argument questions. The first category is answers that are off target, which is to say that they're like not even relevant, right? They're like irrelevant. They're outside the scope of the argument. That's one category.
Yeah.
And then I can just quickly mention this like kind of sub variants of that. And then the second is you have answers that are on target, but they're still wrong. So they're relevant to the argument. They're relevant to the conclusion, but then they have something else about them that makes them wrong. So if you want, I can quickly kind of break down what those would be.
Right. Like, it's like saying, it's like, okay, yeah, sorry, I'll just let you break it down rather than trying to presuppose what you're going to say.
Okay, well, yeah, I mean, the off-target ones. So, yeah, I mean, the most common wrong answer, pattern on these questions is definitely just like outside the scope or irrelevant, right? Like always you'll have answers that are irrelevant to the conclusion. And this is where precision matters. If you're not really precisely understanding the conclusion, then you're going to miss it. And so that's one thing. Then you have irrelevant comparisons. So this is kind of another form of irrelevant, but it's like they'll make some comparison, like, the number of people that are going to invest in this stock is less than the number of people that would have invested had, something like that. And sometimes those could be confusing. The comparisons could be confusing, but it's helpful to just know that often those comparisons are just just trying to mislead you, and they're irrelevant, basically. And then the third thing that I would categorize under this, like kind of off target, is answers that are in like the wrong time frame. So often on these argument questions, the conclusion is about the future. So it'll be something like, therefore, in the next 5 years, we can expect, oil prices to increase or something like that, right? And then an answer choice will say something like, in the past 5 years, oil prices have decreased or something like that. And that will basically always be wrong, because if you're trying to draw a conclusion about the future and you're being given evidence about the past, I'd say just pretty universally, that's going to be wrong. So that's another type of like irrelevant or sort of outside the scope type answer. And then there's the on target, but still wrong. And so one obvious one here, I think, to people who have practiced these is, on strengthen and weaken questions, you often have an answer that's opposite, right? So if it's a strengthen question, they give you an answer that weakens it. You just have to be careful that you remember which direction you're going. And then you can have answers that are too modestly worded. So again, like a word like some on a strengthen or weaken question will almost always be wrong. Mm-hmm. And the opposite is true on other questions. So you can sometimes have answers that are too extreme. So that is not a problem on a strengthen or weaken question where you want a strongly worded answer. But on an inference question or an assumption question, usually, the inference that you can draw is like a pretty modest inference. And same thing with the assumption is usually something that's like not a big kind of grand overarching assumption. It's usually something you don't even notice. Mm-hmm. So on those questions, then like a really strongly worded answer tends to be wrong. So anyway, those are all things that like, it sounds like a lot to like memorize, but if you practice these questions and you really pay attention to those wrong answer patterns, it's like enormously helpful because you could be like, okay, nope, 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 nope. And then, the right answer might be very suboptimal, but you'll be like, okay, like I could see how that's right. And these ones are just definitely wrong.
Yeah, and I think that that's one of the ways, particularly on the harder versions of these questions, that they make it really hard, right? Is they make it so that the right answer is just okay, but then all the wrong answers have something wrong with them.
Yes. And again, I think that's something we touched on in that other episode about the getting rid of ambiguity in the verbal questions. But yeah, mm-hmm. Like in fact, I wouldn't have remembered this, but because I listened to the episode, you used the word I think you quoted like a Simpsons thing, or maybe it's Futurama. I think you said that the technically, I'm technically right.
Correct is the best form of correct. Yeah,
that's right. Yeah, exactly. Like the wrong answers will be technically wrong. They'll be justifiably incorrect. You could explain what makes them wrong, even if they sound better than the right answer.
Yeah, that makes a ton of sense.
Okay, well, so I guess the other, maybe the last thing then to round this out. Again, we could go into so much more detail, like if we wanted to, with like an actual question, and we could really break it down. But I guess the other thing, high level, would be to maybe just mention some of these other question types, mm-hmm. like inference and the like explain, resolve, and boldface. We could quickly talk about those and strategy for those.
Yeah, that sounds great.
Okay, inference is pretty easy. Okay, what's hard about these questions is recognizing that they're asking you to draw an inference. So these questions happen a lot on traditional reading comp. Mm-hmm. So I think anyone who's practiced with the GRE, like they'll have done these questions a lot on traditional reading comp. But occasionally you get like what I call really like an argument question, where they make up some like fictitious set of facts and they just ask you what inference could be drawn or what conclusion. So right. The key is to recognize that that's what they're asking you, is to draw an inference, number one. And then number two is understanding that almost invert almost the opposite of everything we just talked about with strengthen and weaken type questions. Like they're not giving you an argument that you want to kind of poke holes in. They're giving you a set of facts from which to draw a conclusion. So you really have to read that set of facts as a set of facts and just be like, okay, like whatever they say here, I'm going to just treat this like it's absolute ironclad fact. And then I'm just going to go to the answers and say, what could I conclude definitely if those facts are true? Mm-hmm. And, wrong answers will be tempting, things that like might be true, but are not definitely true based on the facts that were given.
Right. And it's usually like a bit of a thing that you have to like kind of logic out. Like I remember there was some example question. I don't remember if you were actually the one I talked through this with, or if it was somebody else, but it was roughly along the lines of like, they're building a road next to a wildlife preserve that has a bunch of deer. What will happen to the deer? And like the right answer, like there was like, the deer will leave from the noise. The deer will like lose their habitat or whatever. But then the right answer was like, the deer will be hit by cars more. Right? Or something like that. Like, and so it's like trying to kind of unlayer the onion and figure out what actually you can really prove.
Yeah. So that question is actually, I actually almost know that question by heart. Mm-hmm. That's how much of a GRE nerd I am that I've done this question so many times. But that's actually not an inference question. Yeah, the deer, it's like Pataska. It's like Pataska Forest, and they're building some housing developments, and it's gonna, more deer are gonna get hit by cars because there's gonna be a lot of roads going through the forest. That's actually a great question to go over, but it's I think it's like an assumption. It's a big four. It's either strength and weakness or assumption question, unless maybe there's some other variant of it that they've created into an inference question. But like, yeah, like you do have to make some leaps, right? Like that is part of the game of these argument questions. Like there's always some leap that you have to make, right? The answer isn't going to be exactly what was said in the passage, but the key with that is that you have to make very small leaps, right? So
okay.
The further you leap from what was given, the shakier the ground that you're standing on.
Mm-hmm.
So it's like you're looking to say something that's very, very close to what was already said. And yeah, the more you start to like be like, well, if X is true, then Y. And if Y is true, then I think that gets me to Z. And if I'm at Z, that would also get me to like A. Well, if you're making that many leaps in your logic, you are probably wrong because, again, it's a standardized test. There has to be a right answer. And you have to ask yourself, would they really expect everyone to create that like chain of logic from like X to Y to Z to A to B? If it's like that many jumps, it's almost certainly the wrong answer.
Right. Okay. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And I think it's like with so many of these things, it's kind of like we talked about in the episode on reducing ambiguity, which is a great one. Go look for it in the archives, guys, if you are listening. And just kind of eliminating any long, windy trains of thought that will get you to the right answer more quickly.
Yep. Yeah. I mean, basically, the smaller the leap, the better. And that's especially the case on inference questions, whether that's on argument ones or even the traditional reading comp. And then, yeah, maybe briefly, if you want to touch on the other two that I think are that appear, boldface questions. Not that common, but occasionally appear. And on these questions, these are unmistakable. They will give you one or two parts of an argument that are in bold, and they'll ask you, what is the role or function of the parts in bold? These are like pretty different from everything else, I would say, on these argument questions, because you're really being asked about the structure of the argument and to like really read for the function of the parts in bold. So on these, I would say you don't need to really even worry about understanding the argument perfectly and like what the gaps in the logic are at all. It's really thinking about structure. So if you read a sentence and you're like, oh, okay, that seems like a piece of evidence. And okay, the next sentence, that seems like a conclusion. And then next sentence, okay, that seems like a further conclusion, so okay, the second one was an intermediate conclusion, and this is like kind of the ultimate conclusion. So you're really kind of like mapping out the argument and the function of the parts of the argument. And really the key there is to do all of it. So people will just like look at the two parts in bold and be like, oh, like I'm just going to kind of key in on those. But you have to understand the function of the parts that surround those bolded parts, because without that, then you're looking at it kind of in isolation and not how it all flows together. So that's really the key, is to try to kind of break down the whole argument. And then, yeah, I guess the other one, do you want me to just quickly mention the explain resolve type questions?
Yeah, sure.
Okay. Again, not as common. If you're going to, if you're listening to this and you're studying for the GRE, if you're going to study for these argument questions, which you should really spend, I'd say, majority of your time on the strength and weaken assumption and useful to evaluate. But the explain resolve ones, it'll say something like, which of the following would help explain the contradiction above, or, resolve the paradox in the above argument, something like that. And I think, again, just having done this for so long with so many people will kind of tend to treat these like strengthen questions, where you're just trying to like, quote, strengthen the argument because it's like explaining it. But it's not really a strengthen question, because there isn't necessarily this like gap where there's evidence and a conclusion and some jump that you're making. It's more often what you have is just two things that don't play well together. So like two facts that seem kind of mutually contradictory. And so again, I think once you understand what to do, these questions are pretty straightforward. Just go and like identify what are the two things that seem to be contradictory, And then either something will come to your mind where you're like, okay, right away I can see what would resolve this contradiction, or you don't, but you're just mindful of what the two contradictory parts are, and you simply go to the answers and be like, okay, what's going to resolve this contradiction, and just be aware that sometimes an answer will kind of explain why one of those points is understandable, but not help
The
not explain
contradiction.
how it could not how it could coexist with the other one, basically, and that's going to be a wrong answer.
Got it. Okay. Yeah, that makes a ton of
Yeah.
sense. Well, yeah, this has been a great episode, and I think a pretty big deep dive on this problem type. Are there any other things you wanted to cover before we wrap up?
Good question. No, I mean, I think the main thing I would just leave people with is just this idea of precision. That like on traditional reading comp, you're going to read the passage, you're going to try to get an understanding of like the author's purpose and maybe the function of the parts of the passage. But like on these argument questions, the key is you have to just like turn the knob of precision to like 11
Hmm.
basically, and be like, I'm going to take this conclusion and read it word for word, and I'm going to read the evidence word for word, and I'm really going to think about exactly what are the gaps here. And same thing with the answer choices, like what exactly are the word some versus the word most. So I think if there's one takeaway is that you have to train yourself to have a level of precision on these questions that goes beyond what like you would that you ever really doing in the real world.
Cool. Yeah, thank you so much, Brian. This has been GRE Snacks, hosted by Tyler from Achievable with Brian Prestia from Reason Test Prep. Achievable has a great online GRE course you can try for free at achievable.me, and you can use the code podcast to get 10% off at checkout.